My name is Emily, and for most of my friends and family, I was living what they thought was the perfect love story. I had been married to Daniel for 8 years, and to the outside world, we were the picture of stability. A charming couple with a comfortable home, steady careers, and a relationship that seemed immune to the storms other couples faced. I used to believe it myself, holding on to the idea that Daniel and I were unshakable, that we would grow old together no matter what. But life has a cruel way of unraveling illusions when you least expect it. It started so subtly that I didn't even notice at first. Over the past 2 years, my body had changed. A demanding job, long hours, and the emotional toll of a family illness had left me with less time and energy for myself. I had gained some weight, not a dramatic transformation, but enough for me to notice in photos and in the way my clothes fit. I was self-conscious, but I never thought it would affect my marriage. Daniel still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, still sent me funny texts during the day, still held my hand when we watched TV. I thought love was deeper than the number on a scale. But looking back now, I realized there were cracks forming long before I saw them. There were moments when his eyes lingered just a second too long on someone else, or when he complimented another woman's fitness in a way that made me feel invisible. There were times he'd suggest we do something active instead of having dinner, and I'd laugh it off, thinking he was just trying to be healthy. The truth was, my marriage was slowly slipping into a dangerous place, and I was too busy holding on to the image of us to see that Daniel's love for me had already started to fade. That was the beginning of a story I never thought I'd have to tell. A story where my biggest heartbreak wouldn't come from a stranger, but from the man I trusted most in the world. It began with tiny remarks, so wrapped in casual tones that I almost convinced myself they meant nothing. Daniel would say things like, "Remember when you used to wear that red dress? It looked amazing on you." Or, "You've been working late a lot. Maybe some exercise would help your energy." At first, I smiled and brushed them off, telling myself he was just being considerate, that he cared about my health. But over time, those small comments sharpened, their edges cutting a little deeper each time. He would point out celebrity fitness routines while we watched TV, linger on fitness influencers' photos when scrolling through social media, and once, in front of his friends, he laughed and said, "Emily doesn't run unless it's to the fridge." Everyone chuckled, but my face burned. I told myself it was just a joke, but my chest felt heavy, as if a part of me knew it was more than that. His touches became less frequent, his compliments more rare. I started avoiding mirrors, not because I hated myself, but because I didn't want to see what he seemed to see, someone who wasn't enough. The emotional distance grew like a quiet storm, and I found myself trying harder, cooking his favorite meals, dressing up on weekends, even forcing enthusiasm for things I didn't enjoy, just to feel his eyes on me again. But instead of drawing him closer, it felt like every effort I made only highlighted the gap between us. That's when I began to realize his words weren't random. They were breadcrumbs leading to something far more painful than I could imagine. He wasn't just noticing my body had changed, he was starting to resent me for it. The suggestion arrived like a gift wrapped in good intentions. A tidy solution to everything he'd been hinting at for months, and when Daniel presented it, he wore the earnest smile I used to trust with my whole life. He said he'd found a gym just a few blocks from his office, clean and modern and full of natural light, a place that didn't smell like metal and old sweat but like eucalyptus towels and possibility. And he had met this amazing personal trainer who specialized in sustainable transformations, someone gentle but firm, knowledgeable but kind, the perfect guide for me to get my energy back. He kept repeating the word health like a soft drum beat, as if it absolved every other motive. "It's not about how you look, Em. It's your health. It's your confidence. It's us being active together again." I wanted to believe him so badly that the wanting became a kind of anesthesia, numbing my doubt as he pulled up the gym's website and showed me glossy photos of people high-fiving under skylights. He had already booked me a complimentary assessment, already bought me a pair of high-waisted leggings and a breathable tank in my size, already printed a calendar with early morning slots highlighted in cheerful yellow. "It would be fun," he said. "Like when we trained for that 5K years ago, we were a team then, remember?" And I nodded because I needed the memory to be real again. On the day of the assessment, I felt like I was walking into a showroom of better lives. Everywhere, bodies moved with confidence. Mirrors flashed angles that caught my soft edges. Music thumped like a heartbeat set to a faster tempo than mine. Daniel walked a step ahead, waving at the front desk guy like he owned the place. And then she appeared, the amazing trainer whose name I already knew because he had said it so many times it hung in the air like perfume. Lexi. She had a high ponytail that swished when she turned, skin like a commercial, bright nails that matched her neon shoes, and a smile that could launch 1,000 memberships. Her handshake was firm, her gaze assessing but polished, and she said my name in a way that made me feel both seen and found lacking, like a before photo waiting to become an after. We did the tour, stations of transformation, treadmills with screens playing beaches, racks of gleaming weights, a turf lane for sled pushes that people groaned through with a pride I didn't share. Daniel shadowed us, too eager, adding little endorsements to everything Lexi said. She's the best at glute activation. Wait until you try her mobility warm-ups, babe. You're going to love it. And when she laughed at one of his comments, I felt a prickle along my scalp. Nothing I could call evidence, only an intuition that their familiarity had roots I couldn't see. The assessment was clinical, wrapped in cheerfulness. She took measurements while narrating encouragements, pinched the calipers with practiced neutrality, asked about my sleep, my stress, my goals, and every time I faltered, she filled in the blank for me, as if my plan were already written in her notebook. We'll focus on strength and metabolic conditioning. Nothing crazy, just consistency, she said, tapping her pen, and Daniel nodded so vigorously I thought his head might come loose. She showed me a basic circuit: bodyweight squats, assisted rows, sled pushes, and her hands corrected my form the way a dance teacher would. Light touches on hips and shoulders and knees, and she kept saying, "Good, good," while Daniel filmed a few seconds on his phone for progress tracking. When I shot him a look, he grinned and said I'd want to see how far I'd come later, and I tried to swallow my discomfort because resisting now felt like rejecting the possibility of fixing us. Before we left, Lexi suggested 3 sessions a week to start, mornings at 6 because the day can't steal your willpower if it hasn't begun, and Daniel jumped in before I answered and said 6 o'clock worked perfectly. We love mornings, don't we, Em? And I heard myself agree like a ventriloquist's doll. On the drive home, he was buoyant, talking about macros and hydration as if he'd discovered a new religion, promising to meal prep with me on Sundays, insisting we could make it fun, we could listen to those true crime podcasts I liked while chopping vegetables. He stopped at a sports store and bought protein powder with a label that screamed results, a digital food scale, resistance bands for homework, and a sleek smart scale that measured more than weight. It measured destiny. That night, he set up a spreadsheet titled Emily's Journey and inputted my baseline numbers with a reverence that felt like pressure dressed as devotion. Our first official session was a blur of effort and humiliation, sweat slicking my temples while Lexi counted reps like a metronome and Daniel hovered nearby, clapping at the end of each set with the enthusiasm that was more performance than support. Lexi's pep talk rhythm was part sermon, part sales pitch. You are not your yesterday. Your body is smarter than your doubt. This is about being strong for the life you want. And when she said, "We'll get your wedding body back," she meant it as inspiration, but it landed like a slap. A reminder that the body I owned now wasn't good enough to love. I caught Daniel's smile at that phrase, quick and bright and unguarded, and I told myself it was because he remembered our vows and not because the word wedding sounded like restoration of a fantasy he missed. In the weeks that followed, the gym became a third party in our marriage, a place we went to worship the idea of a future where we felt like players on the same team again. Only I noticed that Daniel talked more about Lexi than about me, quoting her as if she were scripture, forwarding her emails about posture and protein timing, sending me screenshots of her Instagram stories with captions like, "See how disciplined she is," or "This is the mindset." He urged me to follow her account, and I did, scrolling through a grid of bronzed abs and inspirational captions that felt like excerpts from a book where I was not the target audience. And I hearted a few posts because not doing so might mean I wasn't committed, and I wanted so badly to be seen as committed. At home, small rituals shifted. He set reminders on my phone for water breaks, laid out my gym outfit each night like a parent packing a child's school bag, praised me when I ate salmon, and raised an eyebrow when I reached for bread. But he kept saying the same line, "I just want you to feel amazing, Em. It's about your health." And I decided to tie my hope to that sentence and let it pull me forward. There were moments that pricked like invisible needles. The way Lexi greeted Daniel with a nickname once, Danny Boy, which she covered with a laugh and a kidding when she saw my face. The way he lingered after my sessions to ask her about foam rolling while I toweled off alone. The time his phone lit up during dinner with a message preview that said, "Tomorrow 6 a.m. still good? I can stay a bit longer if you want to do finishers." And when I looked at him, he said she offered extra time because she was invested in my progress. Wasn't that nice? I told myself it was nice. That gratitude was the adult response. That suspicion was the language of people who didn't believe in themselves. And I tried to be the kind of woman who chose gratitude. And yet, as dawn after dawn found me on that turf lane, pushing a sled while Lexi called out cues and Daniel offered fist bumps at the finish, I felt the strangest kind of aloneness, like I was a project under committee review, rather than a partner being cherished. Still, I kept showing up, writing down my meals, checking little boxes on the spreadsheet, letting the routine become a scaffold I could cling to when the old ache rose. And each night I told myself that if I stuck with this long enough, something inside our marriage would click back into place. Near the end of the first month, Lexi suggested we celebrate my consistency with a fun challenge: Saturday class, group energy, loud music, silly team names, and Daniel's eyes lit up like a kid's as he said, "We should absolutely do it." We arrived to a room humming with bodies and Bluetooth speakers, and Lexi paired Daniel and me with two of her regulars who moved like they knew the choreography of the place. She adjusted my ponytail, tied a knot in the hem of my shirt to give you air. And when she tapped Daniel's bicep and told him he'd be the anchor for the sled relay, a glance passed between them that I filed under gym culture, a shorthand I didn't speak. We lost the relay by a hair. Lexi whooped and said we were warriors. And afterward, as we cooled down, Daniel and Lexi compared playlists, teasing each other about guilty pleasure songs, and I stood there smiling like a woman who belonged. Driving home, he squeezed my knee and said, "See, this is what I meant. This is us again." And I nodded because I needed to believe it, even as a softer voice in me asked why his excitement felt more tethered to the gym's fluorescent glow than to my hand in his. I promised myself another month. A fair chance, a clean slate, and I tucked my doubts into the drawer where I kept mismatched socks and unformed fears, hoping they would stay there, quiet, while I tried to become the woman he said he wanted me to be for my health. The first sign was small enough to dismiss, a blip on the screen of a day already crowded with errands and emails, but it lodged in me like a fishbone. Daniel texted that he had to stay late at the office to finish a quarterly report, and I believed him because he had used the exact jargon he always did: deliverables, deck, stakeholder, and because believing takes less energy than doubting. I decided to surprise him with dumplings from the place he loved, a small truce offering after a week of early alarms and sore muscles, and I drove to his building humming along to the radio, already picturing him smiling at the bag in my hands. The lobby was dim and quiet in that after-hours corporate way, the security guard half watching a game on his phone. He looked up when I flashed my visitor badge and casually mentioned that the entire floor had been cleared since 6 for a building maintenance sweep. I said I must have gotten the timing wrong and stepped back into the elevator, heat prickling my scalp as the doors slid shut. When I called Daniel, he didn't answer, then texted a minute later, "Still in meeting, babe. Can I call you in 30? I stared at the words like they might rearrange themselves into something true, felt the bag growing heavy in my hand, and walked back to the car without the surge of accusation I might have once had. Instead, a slower impulse took hold, the kind that had grown in me since the gym became a third language I was trying to learn. Check the facts, be systematic, don't jump. I opened the Find My app because I had before, not to spy but to coordinate pickups and grocery runs, and there it was. A pulsing dot not at his office but 2 blocks from the gym, hovering over a juice bar with an aggressively optimistic name. I told myself he might have stepped out to grab a smoothie, he might be on a call, he might be thinking of me even now, and I drove the few minutes on autopilot, the dumplings cooling between the seats. Through the big front window, I saw them before they saw me. Daniel and Lexi at a corner table under a plant wall scripted with neon words about hustle, their heads close in the way of people sharing secrets and not a training plan. He had his forearms on the table, relaxed, the posture I hadn't seen at our dinners in weeks, and she was laughing with that bright, manufactured joy I'd been told to emulate during finishers, her hand briefly touching his wrist as if to steady him through something difficult, except the only difficult thing seemed to be my breathing. I didn't walk in. I stood on the sidewalk with my bag and told myself to watch, to gather, to let the data build its own sentence. They lingered over bowls and smoothie cups for 40 minutes, long after a client-trainer debrief would have run dry. And twice he took out his phone and angled the screen toward her. She tapped something and slid it back, and when she got up to throw away trash, she squeezed his shoulder like a claim. I drove home with the dumplings unopened and placed them in the fridge as quietly as if silence could undo what I'd seen. After that, the signs bloomed in clusters, as if noticing one had planted seeds for others to sprout. His phone, once a shared object on the coffee table, became an extra limb attached to him. He took it into the shower. He flipped it face down when it buzzed. He set a new lock screen with a photo of a mountain at sunrise that wasn't ours. When I asked about the mountain, he said it was a mood goal Lexi had posted. Rise and grind. And laughed at my face like I was being cute for not getting it. He started using phrases that didn't belong to him, referring to days as push or pull, moving our date nights because Lexi opened a slot for me for what he called programming tweaks, a phrase that made me feel like a product in beta. On a Saturday morning, he said he was meeting a coworker to play basketball. When I suggested I tag along and read on the bleachers, he kissed my forehead and said it would be boring, all trash talk and free throws. Later, scrolling through Instagram while icing my shins, I watched Lexi's story and paused at a clip of a sunlit outdoor court, sneakers squeaking. Her caption reading conditioning day with my favorite overachiever, followed by a flexed bicep and a winking face. The frame was tight, but in the corner there was a sliver of Daniel's shirt, the one with our city's skyline I'd bought him at a street fair. I replayed it until the loop made me dizzy, then set down my phone and listened to the ice shift in its bag like a small avalanche. It became a pattern I could have charted. Late office nights that coincided with Lexi's after-hours community boot camps, lunch meetings that lined up with her midday mindset sessions, Sunday recovery walks that mapped neatly onto her geotagged favorite trail. I told myself to be careful. That correlation wasn't causation. And still the map formed lines even a stranger would understand. One evening, his phone lit with a notification while he was in the shower, my name on it as the music source switched, and a preview floated to the lock screen. Proud of today? Same time tomorrow? I can book the studio if you want more privacy. The contact name was LJ, which could have been anyone except it wasn't anyone. It was the way she signed her captions. And my own name in his phone remained simply Emily. I stared at the message until the screen went dark and then sat very still, waiting for the wave of fury that didn't come. What rose instead was an old, brittle sort of sadness at how efficiently I was becoming displaced, not by some romantic foe with grand gestures, but by time and attention redistributed like budget cuts. When he came out wrapped in a towel and steam, I asked how the meeting went, careful not to let my voice tremble. He kissed my cheek and said, "Productive, babe. You'll feel it in tomorrow's session." And I thought of the message promising privacy and tasted metal. I started measuring not calories, but minutes. How long we spent eating together versus how long he spent at the gym. How many times he asked about my day compared to how many times he recited something Lexi had said about recovery or grit. How often his laugh rang easy around her and how carefully he rationed it at home. The imbalance became a ledger I didn't want to keep, but couldn't stop updating. I found receipts in our shared email for smoothies and post-workout snacks time-stamped at hours we never trained. I noticed he began to smell like the gym even on days we were off, the distinct blend of eucalyptus and rubber and her perfume, a citrus note that followed him into our sheets. Twice I tried to bring it up gently, framing it as concern for boundaries, and both times he pivoted so quickly I wondered if I had imagined speaking at all. "She's dedicated to her clients," he said. "You should be grateful. Not everyone would care enough to go the extra mile." In the cramped space of our bathroom, I watched him in the mirror while he said it, how easily he aligned himself with her generosity, how effortlessly I became the ungrateful one. The discovery stopped being about isolated moments and became a landscape I could navigate without a map. I knew the rhythm of their check-ins and the cadence of their jokes. She called him coach when he offered unsolicited advice to other members. He teased her for her obsession with matching shoelaces. And I learned to predict when his eyes would glaze over during our dinners, a telltale sign that his mind had already stepped onto the turf lanes where she waited with a timer, and that specific praise he'd started craving like sugar. The night I finally admitted it to myself came quietly, almost kindly, when I sat across from him at our kitchen island and watched him text with a small private smile, dumplings steaming between us. The ones I'd promised myself I'd never buy again, and saw that he was elsewhere in a way that had nothing to do with betrayal as a cinematic act. The betrayal was logistical, a calendar full of choices that placed her at the center of his orbit and me on the edge, always rotating toward a next day that looked exactly like this one. The humiliation arrived dressed as a celebration, which felt like the meanest trick the universe could play, because when Mark, one of our oldest friends, invited us to his rooftop birthday, I told myself it would be good to be around people who knew us as a unit, a chance to reset the narrative in a setting where our history could defend me. Daniel insisted we get there early to help set up. And on the way, he casually mentioned that he'd invited Lexi because she'd saved his back with mobility work, and Mark would love her energy. And the words slid over me like oil, hard to hold, harder to protest without being cast as the jealous wife in someone else's sitcom. I told myself it would be fine, lots of people would be there, and I could manage one evening of polite small talk with my personal trainer in attendance. The air was warm enough for sundresses and bad decisions, string lights drooping like sleepy constellations while a playlist of 90s throwbacks bounced off the skyline. Mark hugged us, smelled like whiskey and gratitude, and handed me a plastic crown that said, "Party Queen," as a joke. I was still laughing when Lexi arrived in a white halter top that turned every head, including Daniel's with such immediate obedience I felt myself recede by inches. She hugged Mark like they were old friends, hugged me like we were gym buddies, and when Daniel introduced us, he said, "This is Emily. Lexi trains her," crisp as a resume bullet. And Mark blinked because for 8 years he had introduced me simply as Daniel's wife. I swallowed the sting and told myself to be gracious. I poured drinks, I handed out napkins, I snapped photos on other people's phones so I would not have to watch too closely. And each time I looked up, I caught some tableau of Daniel and Lexi that shaved a thin slice off my dignity. His hand braced against her lower back as he leaned to be heard over the music, her palm resting briefly on his forearm when she laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. The bartender grinning as he set 2 skinny margaritas in front of them and called them lovebirds, a throwaway word Daniel didn't bother to correct. Friends drifted toward them like moths to a brighter lamp. Daniel, who had never once evangelized my marketing campaigns, introduced Lexi as if she were the cure for a collective malaise, telling Jake she'd fixed his hip hinge, telling Lara that her glute circuits were life-changing, telling anyone who would listen that discipline was sexy while his eyes never left her mouth. I became the helper, the photographer, the one who caught a napkin before it blew off the cake. Twice someone handed me their phone and said, "Can you get one of Daniel and Lexi?" And I took the photo because to refuse would be to confirm the thing we were pretending wasn't happening. And people threw out words like power duo and goals and I need a Lexi in my life, and each word plinked into me like hail. Jess, who had known me since college and recognized the telltale way I smile when I'm trying not to cry, pulled me aside near the cheese board and asked under the cover of slicing brie, "Are you okay?" And I said I was fine because the alternative was releasing the wild animal inside my chest. When Mark called for a toast, everyone circled in with glasses lifted, the city swimming beyond the railing. He thanked us for showing up, and then, because Mark is the kind of person who loves giving out impromptu awards, he made up silly superlatives for his guests. He gave Daniel, most likely to start a cult, and everyone laughed. And Daniel, drunk on attention that didn't come from me, cleared his throat and added his own mini toast, turned sideways so the string lights made a halo in Lexi's hair, and said, "To people who make us better. Lexi, thanks for pushing me," like a benediction. And I watched a dozen heads turn toward her, and no one turned toward me. He clinked her glass first. Later, when someone suggested music and dancing, Daniel tugged Lexi's hand before the chorus even kicked in, an eager teenager inside a grown man, and spun her like he'd practiced it. She squealed and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and leaned into him, in that way that photographs beautifully and ruins lives, and he put his hands on her hips to teach her a corny two-step we used to do in our kitchen, and my body remembered being held in that choreography before my mind could stop it. Owen made a grab for the aux cord and cut the music to demand a party trick, and Mark, fueled by nostalgia and IPA, shouted for push-ups, and suddenly there was Daniel, dropping to the deck for a set while people counted off like cheerleaders, and Lexi like a gym ad come to life, laughing and straddling his back to add just 20 pounds of progressive overload, her ponytail swishing a metronome of my indignity as the circle whooped. I stood at the edge with a smile nailed to my face and my drink clutched so hard the plastic creaked, and no one thought to say, hey, maybe not. Because why would they, when everything looked so fit and fun and harmless? When the music came back, someone shouted for a photo shoot. People clustered in pairs and trios, and Daniel, flushed and bright, slung his arm around Lexi's waist like the most natural thing in the world and called, Em, can you grab this? Tossing me his phone like I was the designated content creator, and I lifted it because I have always done what was needed. And I framed them against the skyline as the photographer chirped, say couple goals, without irony. And Daniel didn't flinch, and my name disappeared into the night like a coin tossed over the rail. Moments later, my own phone buzzed, a notification that I'd been tagged in a story, and when I opened it, there we all were in Lexi's boomerang collage, clinking glasses, mid-laugh, her camera lingering a beat too long on Daniel's face with a caption that read, my favorite overachiever, and 3 fire emojis. And when I checked the comments already blooming like mold, strangers had written, marry her already, and obsessed with this duo, and I watched Daniel repost it with a row of flexed biceps while my hands shook. Jess saw my screen, and her mouth hardened, and she said, this is not okay. But even in my fury, I knew I would be painted as the killjoy if I called it out here, on this roof, during Mark's birthday, under these lights. When I finally found Daniel by the railing, catching his breath like he'd done something heroic, I said softly, do you know how this looks? And he rolled his eyes in that performative, theatrical way that aims more for the audience than for me and said, God, Em, don't be weird, it's just fun. She's my trainer, this is a party. And then he brushed past me to refill her drink. The rest of the night, I moved through the party like a ghost with a responsibility list, collecting bottles, thanking Mark, hugging Laura, pretending I didn't hear 2 acquaintances whispering. I thought Lexi was with him. And no, that's his wife, I think. And the second I wanted to disappear the most was when Mark's cousin asked me if I'd take one last photo of the happy couple, glancing at Daniel and Lexi, and then flushed and stammered an apology when she realized, too late, what she'd said. In the elevator down, Lexi kissed the air beside my cheek and said, thanks for being such a sport, like I'd volunteered for humiliation games, and Daniel laughed along, fingers laced with his phone, which lit again with her name. The Uber smelled like citrus, the same note that had begun to haunt our sheets, and I sat with my crown skewed on my head like a joke that had gone on too long, the city rolling by in smear and gleam while Daniel scrolled and smiled at a screen where I did not exist. And by the time we reached home, the story of the night had already been written in other people's pockets and tagged under other people's names, leaving me to undress in a room that reflected back one truth with cruel, fluorescent clarity. I had become an extra in the life I had built. The morning after Mark's party, the house felt hungover even though I'd barely touched my drink. Silence heavy as a blanket I didn't ask for, and I moved through the kitchen with the muscle memory of a life that was already slipping, rinsing glasses, stacking plates, ignoring the crown still skewed on the counter like a joke that forgot to end. Daniel came out late, hair damp, wearing the t-shirt from some charity 10K he ran without me, and for a second I wondered if he would say sorry about last night, if he would laugh and admit it got out of hand, if he would reach for me and try to repair what had been torn in public. He poured coffee like a man on autopilot and said, we need to talk, in the most ordinary tone, and a strange calm took over me, the kind that shows up when the inevitable finally stops pretending. I leaned against the island and said, then talk. He didn't look me in the eye when he started, which made it worse, because if you're going to break something on purpose, you should at least watch it smash. I don't want to hurt you, he said, and I almost laughed because Hurt was already sitting at our table, eating toast, wearing my robe. He kept going, words he'd rehearsed lining up like track lights. We've been drifting for a long time, Em. You know that. We want different things now. I need someone who aligns with me, with my goals, my lifestyle. He let the word hang there, lifestyle, like a chandelier meant to impress. Say her name, I said, and he flinched, the first honest movement of the morning. Lexi, he said, as if he were introducing a keynote speaker. I didn't plan it. It just happened. We connect. She gets me. She pushes me to be better. I stared at him and let the part of me that wanted to beg, kick, and wail in a locked room inside my chest while the part of me standing in our kitchen said, while I take photos of you for her stories?" He rolled his eyes. The same practiced dismissal he'd used on the roof when I asked if he knew how it looked. And he said, "Don't do that. Don't make it petty. This is bigger than last night. We've both changed. You're not the woman I married." The sentence hit like a clean punch, no wind-up, and it was almost funny how quiet the house stayed when something so loud happened. I thought about our vows and the way my dress had fit then and the way my body held me now through long days and aching nights, and I said, "I am the woman you married. I'm just also a woman who gained weight while holding up our life." He took a breath that made it clear he'd practiced the next line in the mirror. "It's not about the weight. You know I've been honest about health. About wanting us to be a team. You kept resisting. Lexi and I, she prioritizes the same things I do. Discipline, growth, I need inspiration." The word inspiration made something in me go cold because it translated neatly into younger and shinier, and I remembered Lexi's ponytail swishing as she straddled his back for push-ups while our friends counted like a laugh track. "Did you sleep with her?" I asked, flat as a hand on a table, and he glanced at the window like he could crawl out through the light. "We kissed," he said, and then, when I didn't blink, "We slept together once. It was a mistake." The way he said mistake, tender like a bruise he didn't want touched, told me it wasn't his regret he was protecting, but his self-image. "Once," I repeated, and I thought of the message about booking the studio for privacy and how many times a person could define once if convenience demanded it. He kept talking, stacking justifications like sandbags against a flood he'd started. "We tried, Em. I tried. The spreadsheets, the meals, the gym, all of it was for us. But it felt like dragging. With Lexi, it's easy. We're aligned. I feel seen." The last word stung most because I had spent months trying to be seen by him, trying to make my body behave like a public service announcement about commitment, and here he was, claiming invisibility like a stolen jacket. "So what now?" I said, because there are only so many ways to stand in a burning room before you look for a door, and he was ready for that too. He straightened and put his mug down carefully, as if avoiding spills mattered when everything else was spilling, and said, "I think we should separate. It's the fair thing. I'll take the lease on a month-to-month at that place near the gym, just for a while, and we can figure out the house, finances, logistics, all of that like adults. I don't want this to be messy." He said messy the way people say poor, as if it were a character flaw instead of a circumstance, and I realized he wanted a clean break not because it would spare me, but because it would spare him the look of being a man who wrecked a life for a woman with matching shoelaces. "You already made it messy," I said, and I watched the first flash of irritation cross his face, like my refusal to be an easy chapter was an inconvenience he hadn't scheduled. He tried to soften it, reached for my hand across the island, stopped halfway when he remembered he'd already left me somewhere I couldn't get to, and said, "I care about you. I always will. You're family." I pulled my hand back even though it hadn't moved and said, "Please don't call me family while you pack a bag to go to her." He flinched again and finally, he looked at me. I saw the man I married for a second, a flicker of something like shame passing through, and then the flicker went out and the new version of him took over. The one who talked about alignment like it was a moral compass that only pointed toward people with 12% body fat. He went to the bedroom and I heard drawers open, the suitcase thunk on the bed, hangers scraping, and I stood in the hallway because moving felt like a thing I might not stop doing if I started. He walked out with the roller bag he used for conferences, that fake leather thing that had been to weddings and funerals with us, and now it was going to a furnished one-bedroom that smelled like eucalyptus and ambition. He paused by the credenza, and as if to prove he was still a good guy, said, "I'll cover the utilities this month, and the car insurance, and if you want to keep the gym membership." I laughed then, a cracked sound that surprised us both, and said, "I'll decide what I keep." He nodded like we were colleagues dividing assets after a merger. "I'll come by for the rest of my things when you're at work. Less stressful," he added, generosity dripping from him like cologne. "Do not bring her here," I said, and he fired back quick. "Of course not." Even though of course was a currency he'd devalued. He reached for the door and stopped, as if remembering the script required a final line, and said, "I hope you can be happy, Em. I hope you find someone who..." I cut him off because mercy has to be rationed. Go. He went. The door clicked, a small civilized sound after so much brutality. And I stood in its echo and watched the stillness settle where his chaos had been. In the kitchen, his mug sat half-finished beside the crown that said Party Queen, and I picked up the crown and put it gently into the trash because some symbols don't deserve a second life. I didn't cry immediately. The tears arrived later, in inconvenient waves that soaked the shirt I'd slept in and made the room blur. But in that first stretch of quiet, I did something so simple it felt like sacrilege. I breathed all the way down to my toes and named what had happened without editing it for palatability. My husband left me for our personal trainer because I was, in his words, not the woman he married. I said it out loud, and the house didn't collapse, and a thin, hard line of clarity drew itself across my chest like a seam. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how long the hurt would live here. But the final blow had landed, and for the first time in months, the guessing stopped. The guessing stopped, and in its place there was a quiet so exact that I could hear the ice machine cough, a bird scold the morning, and my own voice, small but steady, say to an empty room, "Enough." The first morning after the door closed, I wanted to scorch the world. But instead, I made coffee, opened the kitchen window, and let the cool air tell me I was still here, breath by breath, alive and unchosen and still mine. I started small because small was all I had. I stripped the bed and washed every sheet until the water ran clear of the citrus that no longer belonged to me, bought new linen in a color that felt like mourning, and slept diagonally because I could. I took the crown from the trash, not to wear it, but to look at it and say out loud that I would never again let a plastic joke define my place in a room. I put his mug in a box with his medals and the charity 10K shirt, and slid the box into the hall closet, not as a shrine, but as a boundary. I deleted the gym's app, canceled my membership with 2 sentences that didn't explain more than they owed, and walked into a different place the next day. A quiet community center with squeaky floors and a lifeguard who read paperback thrillers, a place that smelled like chlorine and childhood summers, not eucalyptus and performance. I started swimming because the water didn't ask me to be anything but buoyant. 30 minutes became 40, then 60, and in the pool, my body was an instrument I could tune without witnesses. I found a therapist, and in the small room with the ticking clock, I told the unpretty truth about love and hunger and the way a person can vanish inch by inch while still paying the mortgage on the life that erases her. She didn't offer me MacGyver fixes. She offered me questions that cut and sutured at the same time. Where does your worth live when nobody applauds? What do you want that isn't a reaction to someone else's choosing? What story do you want your bones to tell when you're quiet? I made a plan that wasn't a spreadsheet, more like a constellation. Swim 3 mornings a week. Walk after dinner without headphones and notice one beautiful thing. Cook real food because my body deserves flavor, not because a scale demands it. I let the smart scale die in the corner under a dead outlet and decided my mirrors were for lipstick and laughter tests, not judgment. Jess became my anchor, texting me reminders to eat and sending me ridiculous memes at midnight. And on Saturdays, we tried cheap yoga classes in a studio above a nail salon where the teacher had a cat that wandered between mats and sat imperiously on my stomach during savasana, granting me a kind of furry benediction I didn't know I needed. I said no more than I used to, a small revolution. No to last-minute favors at work that traded my evenings for someone else's comfort. No to dinners where I would be required to pretend I wasn't bleeding. No to a cousin's pointed suggestion that I should fight for my man, because I would rather fight for my peace. I took the money that had once funded protein powder and private studios and bought a heavy Dutch oven, a good chef's knife, and a stack of cookbooks that weren't about macros but about pleasure. I chopped onions and cried for the right reasons, seared chicken thighs that crackled like applause, simmered soups that tasted like apology letters to my own neglected appetite. I reclaimed the living room by moving the couch, as if shifting the furniture could dislodge the ghost of us. And it worked more than I expected. The TV faced a different wall, the light fell differently at 4 p.m., and I could sit with a book and not see a projection of my old life play on the blank space where the console used to be. I stopped watching their stories. At first, I had to physically put my phone in a drawer like a cursed relic, but the silence that followed was medicinal. And days later, I realized I had gone a whole 24 hours without wondering what shoes she wore or whether he laughed at something I would have mocked. I unfollowed quietly, without posting an anthem about boundaries, because I owed the internet nothing. Work changed because I changed. In a meeting where I usually took notes, I spoke. Not to prove that I was resilient, but because my idea was actually better, and when my boss blinked and then nodded and then said, "Run with it," I did. Pouring the discipline I'd once spent on pleasing a man into a campaign that landed clean and clever and human. The deck I built was crisp, the strategy solid, and for the first time in months I stayed late by choice because the work made me feel alive, not because I was afraid of going home to an echo. When the results came in, click-through up, conversion steady, client ecstatic, I printed the email and taped it inside my cabinet with the spices, a private trophy that smelled like cumin and relief. I called a lawyer, not to escalate but to understand, and knowledge slid into me like reinforcement steel. There were rights I had that didn't require his generosity. There were steps to separating assets that didn't depend on his schedule. And there was a timeline that belonged to me now. I made a budget that included flowers because a vase of peonies on a Tuesday afternoon can be an act of survival. And I bought a bicycle with a bell that sounded like laughter when I rode to the farmer's market. I learned the names of the market people. The mushroom lady with the silver braid taught me to sauté oyster mushrooms like steak. The bread guy saved me the last sourdough. And the tomato farmer called me sunshine once and meant it in the friendliest, least predatory way. And I realized that strangers' kindness could nourish me where compliments had once hollowed me out. I started a notebook where I wrote down 3 things I did each day that had nothing to do with him. Swam 8 laps without stopping, finally fixed the leaky sink with a wrench and YouTube, told a coworker her presentation sang and watched her shoulders drop in gratitude. I let myself grieve without performance. Some nights I sobbed with my face in a towel so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Some mornings I woke with that electrical ache under my ribs and carried it to the pool, letting the water hold me until it thinned. On my birthday, I took myself to the movies alone and bought the big popcorn and laughed out loud at a joke meant for a crowd. And walking home in the dark, I felt the city arrange itself around me like a cloak that fit. I made a promise I repeated like a prayer. I will not turn myself into a project to earn what should be freely given. My body, stubborn and brave, responded to being treated like a home. I slept deeper. My skin calmed. My jeans fit differently, not because I punished myself, but because the stress dial finally turned down. Strength returned in strange, satisfying ways. The lid of a jar gave way under my hand. A kid on the subway offered me his seat, and I declined with a grin because my legs felt steady. A coworker asked me to speak on a panel, and I said yes without asking whether I looked like someone who deserved a microphone. The quiet rebuild was not cinematic. No montage smoothed the edges. No triumphant violin swelled in the grocery aisle, but the accumulation of ordinary choices built a staircase, and each day I climbed one step without turning around to see who might be watching. I learned the precise joy of a book finished at 2 a.m., the thrill of a song discovered by accident that felt like a heartbeat I could keep, the relief of a Sunday without plans beyond soup and a long bath and a call to my mother where she told me stories of her stubborn younger self, and I saw the lineage of women who refused to disappear. I didn't forgive him, not yet. And I didn't demonize her because simplifying them would simplify me, and I am not simple. I am a woman who was left and a woman who stayed, who chose herself in increments, who builds quietly, who no longer auditions for a role in her own life. I did not aim my days like darts at his absence. I set them like table settings for one and ate well. The rebuild didn't make me invulnerable. It made me present. And in that presence, the world widened. The silence I built for myself, no more hate watching their stories, no more forensic scrolls through captions, wasn't airtight. Information has a way of finding the body it belongs to, and apparently some of it still belonged to me. It came in drips at first. Not from the internet, but from the messy constellation of people who orbit a life. Jess's coworker, who trains at the same gym, mentioned casually over dumplings that Lexi has a rule about content, that every session ends with photos for her grid, and if the lighting isn't flattering, she makes you redo lunges until your veins behave. She said Daniel looked exhausted in the mirror while Lexi chirped, "Angles, babe, we need angles." And I felt a small, mean spark of vindication die into something quieter, almost pity. Mark texted me a week later with a, "You did not hear this from me," and then told me the rooftop bartender, an old friend of his, had seen Daniel and Lexi again, and watched an argument bloom at the register because Daniel ordered street tacos, and Lexi scolded him for torpedoing progress, loud enough for the line to hear. And when he tried to laugh it off, she said, "Abs aren't built with tortillas," and tapped his stomach with a manicured finger like a brand ambassador disciplining a mascot. Mark added that Daniel tipped too much, like he was apologizing for existing, and I stared at the text bubbles until they blurred. At the farmer's market one Saturday, where I'd learned the pleasure of choosing peaches by scent, I spotted her before she saw me. She'd arrived in a coordinated athleisure set the color of an expensive smoothie and staged a tableau by the heirloom tomatoes, arranging basil and a crusty loaf she hadn't paid for while a friend took burst shots on an iPhone. "Give me local and nourished, but aspirational," she said. Rumors thickened like soup. A woman from my book club who goes to the same physical therapist told me Lexi had a reputation for intense alignments, which was a nice way of saying she took credit for other trainers' programs and corrected people loudly mid-set to make sure anyone filming would catch her voice. Apparently, she had begun optimizing Daniel's schedule with 2-a-days and fasted cardio content at sunrise. And when the shots were done, she left everything where it was and flounced off with an empty tote, captioning later, "Support your farmers," beneath a carousel of produce she never touched. The mushroom lady raised an eyebrow at me as if to confirm the reality we had both witnessed, and I shrugged with a soft, private smile that wasn't quite joy but wasn't grief either. And he'd started showing up at lunch, wobble-legged and hangry, asking strangers if they had a protein bar as if it were medicine. Jess, who cannot keep a kind secret or a mean one for long, sent me a screenshot of Lexi's story where she posted a graphic that read, "Surround yourself with doers, not doubters," over a video of a man's shoes on a treadmill. Those same Skyline sneakers I'd bought Daniel once at a street fair. The comments were turned off and the music was an aggressive remix, and the whole thing vibrated with the energy of someone subtweeting a boyfriend she controlled by calling it inspiration. From Daniel's side, the cracks leaked through in more practical ways. The utilities he'd promised to cover arrived late enough that the email subject lines used bold fonts. And when I texted a reminder, he replied with 3 apologetic emojis and something about unexpected expenses, which I translated into new supplements and studio fees. A week later, he Venmo requested me for half a blender I never used with the caption "fair split." And if there was a joke in there, I didn't get it. A former colleague of his ran into me near the subway, and after a little awkwardness about how to stand with someone you haven't seen since their life detonated, he said gently that Daniel looked stressed in a performative way, like he was auditioning for the role of man becoming his best self and forgetting his lines, and had started leaving early for brand things that didn't sound like work, and the resentment in his team was beginning to smell. Even the city joined in. Walking home one evening, I passed the juice bar with the neon hustle sign and heard Lexi's voice through the open door. Not the motivational chirp, but a thin, sharp note I recognized from a lifetime of women wielding pretty as power. "You're not listening," she said, and the pronoun hung like cologne. "We need a couple aesthetic. Couples get better engagement. We need to coordinate. Think palette, think vibe. And you have to get leaner, Danny. The camera adds 5 pounds and, real life does too." There was a pause then, the sound of a person swallowing himself, and I kept moving because standing still would have been a choice I wasn't ready to own. On another day, at the community pool where my breath had scaled from labored to steady, a woman in the locker room recognized me from my ring and kind eyes and asked softly if I was Emily, the one from the gym situation. And when I nodded, she told me she used to train with Lexi until Lexi insisted on posting a weigh-in without her consent, captioned with an accountability lecture that made her cry in her car. When she confronted Lexi, the answer was a silky shrug. "If you want results, you can't be precious." "She's all surface," the woman said, braiding her wet hair. "No depth, just shiny." I thought about how many of us had been taught to survive on shiny. By then, my rebuild had its own gravity, and the rumors were like meteors that burned out before they could scar me. But every now and then, one landed with a satisfying thud. At a friend's launch party for her pottery line, I saw them across the room. Lexi holding a glass like a prop, Daniel in a shirt so tight it seemed to beg for mercy, and a photographer crouched for candid shots. When the photographer moved on, Lexi leaned in toward a group of influencers with follower counts that sounded like lottery numbers, her body angling subtly away from Daniel as she laughed at jokes he didn't hear, and I watched his face dim by shades, the way a light loses wattage before it dies. He approached her twice, and both times she flitted away on the pretext of networking, mouthing 5 minutes with a smile that never reached him. Later, waiting for the coat check, I heard her telling a girl with a glossy bob that she only dates people with discipline and a brand story, like she was ordering a smoothie with add-ons, and when the bobbed girl asked, "And him?" Lexi waved her hand, the diamondless ring finger a flutter of dismissal. "He's a project," she said. "We'll see." The words knifed under my ribs and then did something unexpected. They dislodged the last sticky piece of shame I thought I would keep forever, because it clarified the equation I'd been solving for months. I had not been left for love or even lust. I had been traded for a brochure. Another sighting arrived by accident. My bus idled at a red light outside a small boutique gym with glass walls. And there, on the turf I used to dread, Lexi was instructing a man I recognized from a sports commercial, her attention laser bright in a way I'd never seen when I was on that floor. Daniel hovered at the edge in a volunteer's smile, moving plates when asked, holding a water bottle, trying to enter the frame. When the commercial man laughed and side-hugged Lexi for a selfie, Daniel stepped forward, but the moment had already sealed without him. She posted the photo seconds later. By the time the bus turned the corner, the caption had edited twice, settling on a cluster of tags that climbed like ivy up someone else's fame. It would be easy to say I gloated, but the truth is smaller, and, I think, braver. I felt relief, the clean kind. The kind you feel when a magician reveals the trapdoor in the saw, and you finally stop wondering if you were the problem. The cracks weren't punishment for what he did to me. They were the natural consequence of how he chose to live, at the level of the lens, fed by applause that can only be eaten in public. In therapy, I said, "I don't need him to suffer," and my therapist nodded like I'd lifted something heavy correctly and said, "You only need him to be responsible for his own choices." And later I sat on my couch in the late light and accepted that he was. And that responsibility often looks like carrying the weight of a person who chose you for a season, and then set you down when the angle changed. If there was revenge in any of this, it wasn't mine yet. It was just the universe's habit of telling the truth in whispers first and then in surround sound. I didn't rush toward the whispers or the noise. I kept swimming, kept cooking, kept saying no and yes in the right proportions, and it became easier to believe that the story wasn't bending toward him at all anymore. But sometimes, when I biked past the juice bar and saw the neon hustle sign stutter, I thought about how a person like Lexi will always look for a brighter mirror, and how a man like Daniel will always need one, and how brightness like that can turn on you without warming your skin. It happened on a Saturday in late September, the kind of sky blue day that makes a city look like it believes in itself. 6 months after the door had clicked and my life had started moving in a different register. My agency was sponsoring a wellness weekend in the park, a mishmash of 5K runners, smoothie stands, yoga mats like lily pads in the grass, and a small stage where panels alternated with demo classes. And because my campaign had helped pull the whole thing together, I was scheduled to moderate a talk called Sustainable Strength, which delighted me because the version of me who used to organize Daniel's macros would not have been trusted with a microphone. I arrived early carrying a tote with my notes and a thermos of coffee, hair in a low braid, wearing a soft blue dress I'd bought secondhand that skimmed instead of apologized. Jess met me with a bag of croissants and a feral grin and said, "You look inconveniently radiant," and I laughed because joy had finally started to sit in my bones like furniture. The park buzzed with endorphins and earnestness. Somewhere a DJ was already playing a remix no one asked for. A golden retriever wore a bandana that said hydrate, and in the middle distance I heard her voice before I saw her, Lexi, bright and frothy, mic'd up for a warm-up demo sponsored by a company that sold leggings with motivational phrases on the waistband. She was flanked by 2 assistants in matching sets, and a photographer dragging a ring light on wheels like hospital equipment, and on the edge of the taped-off rectangle stood Daniel in a fitted tee that clung like a question, holding a duffel and a tripod, eyes already scanning for her cues. I felt the old heat rise and then pass, the way a healed scar flashes in cold air. Jess squeezed my wrist once and said, "We witness, we do not combust," and we moved on. My panel was scheduled after a high-profile guest, a triathlete with a world title and the calm of a man who knows pain intimately and doesn't advertise it. Sponsors swarmed him, assistants hovered, And as he finished a Q&A, the event PR hustled him across the grass toward the demo area where Lexi was still wrapping up, sweatless, radiant, rehearsed. I watched the shift when she clocked him, her smile tilted, her mic voice lowered a half step into something silkier, and the next moments played like choreography she'd practiced in the mirror. She handed her mic to an assistant, slid into his path with a casual, "loved your panel," angled her body to be photographed with him, and in less than a minute, they were laughing like old friends while Daniel stood 2 paces behind, suddenly a background extra in a scene that did not require him. The PR woman said, "We're doing a hero shot with our featured athletes and trainers," and Lexi said, "I can grab my guy," and tilted her chin toward Daniel, then faltered when the photographer, eyeing the composition like math, shook his head and said, "Let's keep it clean. We need symmetry. Maybe just her and the triathlete, unless he's part of your brand story." The question hung there like fog. Lexi's smile did a micro shiver, a glitch, and she said, bright again, "We're focusing on elite pairs today." Then turned to Daniel, not unkind but brisk. "Danny, can you hold my bag? I'll be 2 minutes." 2 minutes became 10 as the triathlete's arm found the professional choreography of a waist, and the photographer shouted cues. "Closer, eyes here, big exhale, perfect." And when they reviewed the shots on the camera, Lexi touched the screen and said, "This is the vibe," in a tone that made the air around her tighten like a ponytail. I was supposed to be prepping for my panel, but instead I watched Daniel in the unspectacular light where real consequences show up. The way his hands clenched on the duffel straps, the cut of his mouth as he tried to look useful. The split second he glanced toward me and then away, as if my gaze were a mirror he wasn't ready to see. I should have looked elsewhere. I didn't. The announcer called a 5-minute warning for my session, and I climbed the steps to the small stage while volunteers adjusted a banner behind us. People filled the folding chairs in ones and twos, then in clusters. The community center lifeguard sat in the back with her paperback. The mushroom lady waved. My boss took the aisle seat like a proud aunt, and Jess took the front row like a bouncer for my feelings. I introduced the panel, an occupational therapist, a nutritionist who hates diet culture with a poet's vocabulary, and a marathoner who trains moms with strollers, and asked questions that were not about punishment, but about steadiness. We talked about building strength like building trust, slow, honest, repairable. We talked about rest as a rebellion. We talked about food as love without ledger. I made a joke about spreadsheets that landed, then told a small truth about failure that landed better, and when the Q&A opened, a teenage girl in an oversized hoodie asked, "What if you feel behind?" And something in me untied itself, and I told her what I had learned precisely. That bodies don't keep score the way shame does. That there is no behind when the path is yours. That if you move because you love your life more than you fear your mirror, the math changes. The applause was warm. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that holds. And as the crowd stood to leave, a woman stopped me to say, "I quit a trainer who made me cry. Today helped." And a man with gray hair and a 5K bib asked for the name of my therapist like an autograph. On the periphery, Daniel lingered, pretending to adjust a tripod leg that didn't need adjusting. Lexi was still at the hero wall, collecting content like stamps. The triathlete's manager handed her a wristband and pointed toward the VIP tent. And when Daniel drifted over, smiling the way people smile when their place is assumed, I watched her touch his forearm in the exact gesture that used to parade as intimacy and say, "Babe, the tent is for talent and press, brand alignment, but I'll text you the after party." Maybe. It's sponsor heavy, super tight. Also, do not eat the sliders, they're sodium bombs and your face will puff in photos. I need you sharp for the 9 a.m. reels tomorrow. And then, as if the gods of symmetry had a flair for theater, the triathlete's manager turned back and asked, "Can we pull in a second trainer for the B-roll? Someone with more athletic contrast?" And Lexi's eyes ticked over Daniel's shoulder to the row of demo trainers stretching on the grass and landed on a woman with calves like commas and a smile like weather, and she called out, "Casey, can you jump in?" with a brightness that slid the blade in without blood. Daniel stood with the duffel while Casey and Lexi bracketed the triathlete in a triangle of photogenic vigor, and when the cameraman shouted, "Perfect, the symmetry sings," I saw the realization cross his face like a cloud. He had become the man on the wrong side of someone else's aesthetic. My panel wrapped and people queued to speak. The event photographer snapped a few shots I didn't mind existing. Jess was practically vibrating with the effort it took not to heckle the air. And in the shuffle, Daniel found himself caught in the tributary of bodies moving toward me. For a heartbeat, we were 10 feet apart, the first time in months that the air between us held both our names. He looked smaller, or maybe just measured. I looked like myself, or maybe just unmeasured, and that difference was the whole story. He opened his mouth and closed it. Behind him, Lexi called, "Danny, content," without turning, already angling her jaw to a better light beside the triathlete's publicist. A volunteer intercepted me with a Sharpie and a stack of thank you cards to sign. A girl with hoop earrings leaned in and said, "Your line about the path? That's going on my wall?" And I smiled because once I would have apologized for not being relevant, and now I knew relevance was a room I could furnish myself. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel set the duffel down in the grass. A small surrender. He watched me for a long beat, the way people at museums watch paintings they didn't expect to feel. And I let him, not as cruelty, but as context. The DJ cued another remix. The retriever with Hydrate chased a frisbee. The triathlete's handler whisked Lexi toward the VIP tent with the phrase, "We'll loop you in," that always means, "We'll see if you fit." And Daniel reached after them with a hand he did not raise. Jess slid to my side and whispered, "He just got told he's not the man she dates." And the line echoed, neat as a boomerang. Not the woman you married, not the man she dates, and if there was revenge, it bloomed right there, quiet and exact. Not a plan I had sprung, but a symmetry the universe loved too much to resist. I finished signing, thanked the sound tech, hugged the OT, and stepped off the stage into sunlight that didn't ask for proof. Daniel took a half step toward me and stopped when a woman from the community pool waved and handed me a jar of jam she'd made with strawberries and stubbornness. I tucked it into my tote like a medal, and when I finally looked at him fully, he tried a smile I had once believed and said, "You look good." And I nodded once because I did, because good had become an internal setting. Lexi was gone, absorbed by a brighter mirror and a tighter door, and he was left standing with a bag that wasn't his and a face working too hard to hold its shape. I didn't say anything generous or cruel. I didn't say anything at all. I let the moment do its math. He waited a week after the wellness weekend to reach out, which felt exactly like him. Enough time for the photos to cycle, for the comments to cool, for the VIP tent to forget his name. The first text was a cautious, "Hey, can we talk?" that arrived while I was stirring onions in my new Dutch oven, and I let it sit there like a fly in amber until the smell turned sweet and the edge of my anger softened into something sturdier than silence. 2 days later, he tried again with a longer message. A confession shaped like a resume. Things with Lexi shifted. She was focused on new partnerships. He felt misaligned. He missed what mattered. And I read the paragraphs like weather, useful for planning a walk, irrelevant to the seasons of my life. Jess, peering over my shoulder as I chopped garlic, said, "He's testing if the door still swings." And I laughed, not kindly. The call came a week after that, his name on the screen like a museum label under an artifact from a civilization I no longer lived in, and the part of me committed to clean endings answered because I did not want to carry a ghost into another room. His voice had the careful brightness of a man trying not to spook a horse. He said, "You look different. Happier." I let the compliment pass without collecting it. He cleared his throat and told the story I had already suspected in outline. The triathlete's manager liked Lexi's look. There were opportunities, content ramped, schedules tightened, and somewhere between a reel and a product shoot, Lexi reclassified him from partner to support, then to distraction, then to liability, when he ate the wrong thing before a brand run and looked puffy in the B-roll. He laughed bleakly at his own line. Abs aren't built with tortillas. And I heard the echo of a bartender's wince and thought, "You chose this." He said she was surface, said it with the air of a man who had discovered a deep truth that everyone else had labeled on the jar. She needed a brand, not a person, he said. I was a prop that got heavy. My silence offered no cushion. He kept talking like a cyclist who has to keep pedaling or he'll fall. He was sorry. He'd been lost. He'd let himself get distracted by metrics and mirrors. He missed us. He saw me at the park and remembered who we were. Could we meet? Could we talk without the noise? I told him he could come by to pick up the rest of his things on Saturday at 3, and that we could talk for 20 minutes, not because he deserved it, but because I did. Saturday arrived polite and bright. I laid his box on the credenza, mug, medals, the 10K shirt, the digital scale charger I'd found behind the printer, and put the kettle on because kindness isn't a currency to spend on the wrong person. It's a muscle. And mine was strong now. He stood in the doorway with flowers he hadn't thought to remove the price tag from, a habit he'd never broken, and for a flicker of a second the muscle memory of 8 years tugged at me, the urge to make him comfortable, to set his guilt down where it wouldn't break. I didn't. He took in the room as if it were a test he hadn't studied for, the shifted couch, the new light at 4 p.m., the vase of peonies that were, in fact, for me, and said, "It looks different," like an accusation softened by nostalgia. I made tea and let him speak first. He tried to frame it as timing, as confusion, as being swept up, words that might have worked on the woman who kept spreadsheets to prove she was trying. But he was talking to the woman who had learned to keep soup on a low simmer and listen for the true parts. Finally, the script exhausted, he said the only honest sentence he had, "I chose wrong," and it hung between us with the weight of exactly nothing. "You chose easy," I corrected. "You chose image. You chose a mirror that told you a story about yourself you wanted to hear. And when it turned, you came here because you remembered I don't turn." He flinched and reached for tenderness. I forgot us. I forgot you. I forgot what you gave me. I want to make it right." The old me would have translated that into a list of tasks. The current me spoke in boundaries. "Making it right isn't coming back," I said. "Making it right is leaving me alone with the life I rebuilt without you." He blinked hard, and I saw the itinerary he'd hoped for begin to scramble. The humble apology, the coffee, the inside joke about the Dutch oven, the suggestion that we try counseling now that he had learned his lesson, and I had slimmed my grief into something more photogenic. "But we were good," he said, and I shook my head because we were good until we weren't, and the moment the math got hard he solved for spectacle. He said he was sorry again, a smaller sorry this time, realer, and I took it because I don't collect apologies as trophies. I file them under closure and let them gather dust. I told him the practical pieces. The lawyer had prepared the paperwork. The utilities were no longer his responsibility. He could coordinate with Jess for the couch he wanted if he still wanted it. He could pick up the rest of his books next Thursday at 6. I'd leave them in the vestibule. He looked at the crown on the bookshelf, the one I'd rescued from the trash to remind me of the rooms I would never stand small in again, and said, almost to himself, "You really are different." "No," I said. "I'm visible." He set the flowers on the counter where my Dutch oven simmered and they looked out of place like plastic in a garden, and he reached for the mug in the box, the one with a chip at the lip, and turned it in his hands as if it could deliver us back into a kitchen where he was still here and I was still waiting to be chosen. "Lexi was," he began, then stopped, the word shallow hovering like a verdict he wanted me to stamp for him. I didn't help him prosecute another woman to lighten his guilt. "Lexi was Lexi," I said. "You were you, I was me, and now we can stop rehearsing what we wish had been true." He asked if he could hug me, and I shook my head because my body is a home, and I choose who crosses its threshold. He nodded, the understanding slow but present, and picked up the box. At the door he paused like a man in a movie who wants a last line that will split the audience. And when none arrived, he settled for the very human, "I miss you." And I answered honestly, "I miss who I thought you were." The hinge didn't creak when I closed the door. It's well-oiled from use. I leaned my forehead against the wood and let a breath move through me that felt like finishing a long swim. Arms heavy, lungs awake, water streaming off a body still mine. I made soup. I texted Jess a thumbs up, and she replied with 6 exclamation points and a photo of the hydrate dog in sunglasses. I sat at my table with a bowl that tasted like patience and called my mother to tell her the news in plain speech. She said she was proud, and then told me again about the stubborn younger self who once moved across a state with a suitcase and a recipe box, and her pride lived in my kitchen like another candle. The paperwork went through 2 weeks later, clean and uncinematic, and I marked it by buying myself a small ring, not as a vow to never love again, but as a visible promise to choose myself first, even when love shows up dressed in apologies. Work kept being work. Emails and pitches and the occasional win that deserved a croissant. And the community center pool kept being the place where my breath measured progress better than any scale. On a Friday afternoon, the mushroom lady tucked an extra handful into my bag because sunshine needs mushrooms, and I laughed with my whole mouth, something I hadn't done in a kitchen with him in years. If there's a moral, it's not that transformation makes you more lovable or that revenge tastes better than soup. It's this. Love that depends on your body being a before or an after is not love. It's audience. Build a life that doesn't need clapping. Eat peaches, swim laps, buy flowers for your Tuesday. And if a man who traded you for a mirror knocks on your door carrying regret and discount roses, you can open the door, take the apology, and still close it. With your self-respect intact and your soup on low, a life simmering that doesn't perform for anyone, not even you.